Welcome to the EW Podcast. I'm Eric White, and today I have the honor of being joined by Dr. Stanton Peele. Dr. Peele is an addiction expert. He's the co-creator of the addiction recovery program called the Life Process Program, and he's the author of a number of books on addiction, including the 1975 Love and Addiction, which he co-authored with his friend Archie Brodsky, and includes other seminal works on addiction like Diseasing of America and The Meaning of Addiction. His newest book is a memoir titled A Scientific Life on the Edge, My Lonely Quest to Change How We See Addiction. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Peele.
Eric, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate your hospitality.
Is there anything I missed from that intro?
That was good. You
Okay.
got everything essential. You seem to be somebody who, are those your natural teeth, Eric?
Yeah.
I mean, anybody who's taken that good care of their teeth is probably somebody who, you pay attention to some important details in life.
Well, I think I might be getting a little benefit from this light I'm using here, because normally my teeth don't look as white as... Cool. Well, yeah, thank you very much for joining me, Dr. Peele. I've been looking forward to this conversation very eagerly. I've enjoyed your memoir, and yeah, just thank you for taking the time to chat.
All right. Fire away, Eric. I'm eager to hear your reactions and your queries and your challenges and your support.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess before we get into that, the memoir and your work, just some background on how this came to be. We have a mutual friend in Zach Rhodes, who you co-authored the book Outgrowing Addiction with, that came out in 2019. And you also worked together on the Life Process Program, both the service and also a YouTube show, which I very much enjoy. And maybe we can talk about that at the end, because I think that's a really good resource.
I don't know how you know Zach. Maybe you were about the same age as he is. He's been my memoir is about love. You mentioned Love and Addiction, which was published in 1975, which, if you do the math, is quite a few years ago. And part of the memoir is how, with my offbeat and unpopular approach to addiction and my somewhat, aggressive style, I've persisted for 45 years, maybe going on a half century. And it's just been a great boon for me to know Zach, who's half my age, roughly speaking. He's in his mid-30s, who largely shares a point of view with me. And, he's more involved in a kind of technological era. We do podcasts together. But also, perhaps you've noticed, we have somewhat different personalities.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't want to misquote Zach, but he says something about himself as like, I object without being objectionable. He has a good gift for being facilitative with people. At the same time that his view of addiction is quite similar to mine. And on the one hand, he's popular. He's popular locally and on the internet. The question, contrasting our styles, is whether sometimes he's not able to get across exactly where he's diverging from the opinions of the people that he's working with, even, cooperatively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I love the contrasting in styles. That's something I think I've told Zach before, is that watching those episodes, you kind of get a teacher and student kind of thing, where you're talking from your experience and all the things you've learned, and Zach takes it a little more philosophical. And it's just a good combination. I really enjoy it. And I'll definitely put a link to that in the notes for this episode if anyone's curious to check it out. You guys basically take current events and look at them through your model of addiction and analyze what is actually going on in a probably heterodox way, I would say. So let's get into your work. The memoir it packs a punch. There's a lot of ideas in there. You don't save anyone from your criticism. It's a very upfront book. Let's just start with a broad question. What was the goal of writing this memoir? You have so many books already published on the topic that have been very influential. How does the memoir fit into that life work?
Well, I guess there are two broad goals. One is I've been around so long that sort of people almost forget I'm around. You know what I mean? They say, well, you wrote Love and Addiction 1975. You mentioned The Meaning of Addiction 1985. Diseasing of America is 1989. That's a person from well into the last century. And there are, the way life works is there are people who make great contributions at some previous era. People say, oh, that was a great contribution. And then they forget about them entirely because that's just the way life works. We're dealing with who's around now. And I didn't want that to happen. I wanted to link up and there's a whole group of people who are coming to challenge the disease theory of addiction. Carl Hart, Maya Salovitz, Johan Hari, Mark Lewis, they all know who I am. And they kind of link to me more or less differently. But I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of the seminal role I played, in which they all give me credit for one way or another. At the same time, I feel I have a fundamentally different view of addiction, which to some extent, even the critics of addiction who have joined me in criticizing the brain disease model of addiction, and even to some extent AA and 12 steps, haven't gone all the way towards grasping. And I'll just try and lay that out right here. Drug addiction is not a separate category of human behavior from how people interact with other involvements. And so creating a whole category, let's look at drug addiction, it's outmoded. And in fact, ironically, the diagnostic manual of the American Psychiatric Association doesn't call any drugs addictive. The only thing it calls addictive is gambling. So to some extent, even mainstream psychiatry has grasped this evolution. And yet there's a tremendous cultural lag in adopting it. And people still think, well, heroin, and now they've thrown in with heroin stuff like fentanyl. Well, they're like a special category of human behavior that we need to regard as outside of normal experience. And I find that's true more or less to some extent, even with my compatriots who kind of generally share my point of view. And Carl Hart, of course, is a remarkable human being. He's written a book recently about drug use for grown-ups where he echoes things I've said about heroin for a long time. There's a wide range of ways that people use heroin and opioids. They're the same range of ways that people use food and gambling and have sex and love relationships, more or less destructive depending upon who they are or where they're at. But Carl doesn't devise an alternative model of addiction. He just leaves that out there. Heroin, it's not the drugs per se are dangerous or addictive. You can use them in many different ways. And then he says, some people obviously misuse drugs, but then he stops short of saying, well, what makes those things addictive for some people? And I feel that I've created the model of addiction, a way of thinking about addiction, which allows us to access that issue. And so at the same time that I'm seeking to be remembered for being seminal in this field, I'm still trying to clarify and establish a view of addiction which is accurate and appropriate and useful.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely want to get into some of these, the contemporaries that you mentioned in the book. We can do that in a second. I just want to make sure before we move on that it's clear to the listener and viewer what your view actually is and how it differs. So maybe I can give my sort of summary of what you just said and my take on it, and then you can correct me. So as you said, these substances like heroin or fentanyl, whatever, they don't exist outside of the normal range of human behaviors. They are the same thing. They bring the same sort of reliability, expectations, and fulfillment that something like gambling or sex or shopping would do. It's just it happens to be a substance and not an action, right? So your view is that all of these things, that all of these life experiences that people can participate in can become addictive, but that is not a result of brain or brain chemistry or genetics. Is that fair?
Yes, or obviously it's self-evident, or the chemistry of a drug. So if somebody says, oh, here's the opioid molecule, here's what it does, then the first thing you say is, well, what about meth and cocaine already, who have totally different chemistries, and the death rates for them have been accelerating also. So even within the drug area, the concept that a specific chemical impacts the body in a specific way doesn't work to explain what we're observing. And then obviously, when you go outside that realm to gambling, as the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual does, there's an international classification of diseases. They include gaming and sex. Once you start saying, well, those are things that can become overwhelmingly destructive involvements that we can call addictions, you're not talking about chemistry or biology or neuroscience, because those things impact the body and the mind and the nervous system in such a varied ways that you can't put them all in one chemical or medical or neurochemical category.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's seems to be a confusing thing to maybe separate here, in that all of these things are affecting brain chemistry, right? Like these drugs, these actions, when you play video games, you're maybe getting hits of dopamine or adrenaline. It is affecting brain chemistry. But I guess the crux of the disagreement you have with the brain disease model and places like Alcoholics Anonymous or reductionist approaches to addiction is that it doesn't start with the brain, right? It starts from outside.
That's a good shot, Eric. Let me say it this way. In a way, it's a reductio ad absurdum to say that every powerful experience you have has sub-reflection in the brain. I mean, to say, well, when you have sex, that affects your brain. When you fall in love, that affects your brain. When you eat, or when you anticipate eating, or when you go to a casino and you're in an excited state, there is something going on in your brain. And neurochemistry, that's just another way of saying you're a human being. What is the relationship of those events to addiction? And what I'm saying is that truism, that your chemistry and your neurosystem is engaged when you do anything, is not only is it not an explanation for addiction, it's not even a clue for addiction. You can't start tracing back. This is what you said. You can't start tracing backwards from, oh, look, sex makes your brain do this, therefore it makes you be addicted. Sex is an extremely powerful experience, but you cannot, I'm glad you used the word reductionism, you cannot reduce sex addiction to how the sex affects the brain. The same way you can't reduce cocaine addiction to how cocaine affects the brain. You can measure how cocaine affects the brain. You can do MRIs and you can see bright spots. And so people take cocaine, and then some people, after they take cocaine, say, I'm not going to live without taking cocaine every day. And some people say, that was interesting, or that was fun. But, I've got my day's activities to do. And I mean, there's in one part of the book, I answer the question, why am I not addicted? And I referred to a study by a woman named Chris Johansson, whose husband at one point was the head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, Charles Schuster, called Bob Schuster. And they did it, it was a reward psychology study. Not opioids aren't that popular. Amphetamines are popular.
Oh yeah.
Most people who take amphetamines say, "Wow, I'm uplifted. I enjoy life more." So she was a behavioral psychologist. She's still alive, and they gave students at the University of Chicago amphetamines, and they said, "Well, how do you like it?" And they said, "Wow, I like it a lot." And then they did 5 iterations of the study, and the subjects were less likely to take the amphetamines each time. And by simple reward psychology, you go, well, wait, they like it.
Yeah.
Why don't they take more? And the answer gets to be so dumb and commonsensical. I mean, the one thing I think about Stanton Peele is, Stanton Peele just talks common sense. They're students at the University of Chicago. They want to become, PhDs and MDs. And anything that's interfering with their daily life and their studying and their larger goals by which they define themselves is something they're going to discard and not do. I love doing present study. So I go to a group of people and I say, opioids horribly addictive, aren't they? It's just they take over your body. By the way, has anybody in this room taken an opioid painkiller? And everybody raises their hand. And I say, oh, did you become addicted? Now I'm dealing with a bunch of people, they're counselors and middle-class people. And nobody raises their hand. I said, now come on, don't be shy. Did you feel like they were very alluring to you? And so a group of people, 5 or 10 will raise, out of 100 or 200 or 500, raise their hand. And I'll say, so you found it very alluring. Opioids worked for you, but you still didn't become addicted? And they'll say, why was that? And then they'll say, well, what am I going to do? You know what I mean? I have children. I have a job. I have my, image of myself. I'm just not going to keep taking opioids. And so that commonsensical balancing act, which is just human beings, that's how human beings function. We've lost track of that by projecting this model of addiction, which means that you can't make those kinds of assessment. And I lay that at the feet of Nora Volkow, who's currently the head of National Institute on Drug Abuse, who her first meme was, it's all about the dopamine. It's not all about the dopamine. Everybody gets dopamine from cocaine. Only some people go off the deep end. And then the second thing she said is addiction is a disease of free will. Where did she come up with that? I mean, why do people quit smoking? Which most people know, a lot of people know about. And it gets down to, well, they didn't want to keep smoking.
Yeah.
It might have taken a while. Might have taken longer than they wanted to. And if you ask them why they quit smoking, they said, well, I had children. Well, people were looking down, whatever, stupid meaning human being reasons. And so my underlying radicalism and almost, my fetish is that the main way of purveying addiction, Nora Volkow has been head of the NIDA since 2003. 750,000 people have died of drug use since then. Nobody thinks that we're improving our ability to deal with drugs or lessening the addiction rate. Nobody, including Nora Volkow. And the model that she was presenting of bringing, which she's sort of stepping back from now. In fact, my wild, crazy argument, and this is, you can see why I'm not as popular as I might be, is our view of addiction is actually encouraging our detrimental use of drugs and our inability to escape addiction by convincing people that they don't have the power or the right or the capacity to change their behavior, that they're a slave to a drug.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that recovery side here momentarily, because I think that, that's one of the major distinguishing factors of your work compared to the work of disease model approaches like Alcoholics Anonymous. Is one is you're stuck for life, and yours is no, you just need to fix your life kind of combination. So, but before we get there, well,
That's
kind
the
of,
essential difference, right?
yeah, I think before we get into those specifics, though, I want to go into, I guess this kind of links what I want to talk about in the recovery aspect, but it's the becoming an addict or getting an addiction. And you said you were hinting at something there that I found to be pivotal in your approach and in your model is the impact of the environment and social, economic, or cultural aspects, in the surrounding that cause addiction. And to illustrate that, I just want to tell a quick story about myself from the past 3 months that I was really looking forward to sharing with you and see if this maps onto your approach. So my girlfriend and I have been having a somewhat chaotic beginning of the year. She lost her dog. Her family dog died on the January 20th Capitol riots. Her sister passed away. We had a move going on. I was working 40 hours a week, full-time job. I was also doing a bunch of side projects. My time was stretched thin. I was stretched thin. And I think around in March sometime, I started taking Adderall. So going back to your amphetamines here, I started taking Adderall, and I was taking anywhere from like 30 to 120 milligrams per day. And
What was your worst period previously of Adderall use?
I rarely used it. I would use it. Sometimes to be honest, sometimes we would get together with friends and want to stay up all night, and we might take a little bit of Adderall.
So
And
you were using it recreationally, and you feel it got to a kind of more red flag zone.
Yeah. There was times where I would wake up in the morning during this. It was about 3, almost 4 months. This period, I would wake up wanting an Adderall, knowing that feeling as though I needed it to get what I needed done, to get what I needed to get done that day, but also having the sense of guilt of I'm relying on this. I don't want to rely on this. And during the later days of that period, I started to remember my talk with Zach Rhodes and reading Outgrowing Addiction. And it just popped in my head like, okay, if they're right, once we move into our new place and all of this dust settles, I should be able to stop using it, no problem. And lo and behold, as soon as we moved in, I visited my parents for a week. I didn't take any Adderall with me. And after that point, I haven't taken it since. It's been over a month, no cravings. Life has calmed down dramatically. I have more control in my day to day. And so that to me is just the epitome, I think, for me, at least in my experience, of what you're talking about, of how we turn to things to help us get through our day-to-day life. And once those features that are causing chaos in our life are taken care of, we can step back then from that addiction.
I go one step further than that. You're talking about a relatively short period of time. Part of what I say is that all of us have experienced addictions. I mean, if you say to somebody, have you ever been in a relationship, an intimate relationship, where you were really being self-destructive, where you were making decisions that were bad for yourself and possibly the other person? Everybody kind of knows what you're talking about. You know what I mean? But not everybody, marries that person. If you watch, MSNBC at night, they don't murder the person. They don't commit suicide.
Yeah.
But, Anthony Bourdain committed suicide, and I have a blog on the LPP about why did he kill himself just then after he had a younger girlfriend and he had been observing her. I don't want to use a pejorative term, prancing around with the younger guy in Rome. Did that unhinge him? A lot of people now feel there's a new documentary out that said, yeah. So everybody knows what addiction's about, and it comes on a sliding scale of how bad it is. And with all due respect, and I really love your example, Eric, you were, somewhat mildly, there are people that use, amphetamines and meth in a worse way than you. And in a way, part of what outgrowing addiction is about is, let's take the big picture. Sure, there's individual stress, like Vietnam. A lot of people took heroin in Vietnam and they were classified as addicted by standard clinical definitions. When they got home, 90% or more stopped taking it. Well, some continued taking it, but they didn't act in an addictive way because they got re-put into their regular frame of life with the regular values and the regular situation going on. And you have that advantage. You're, not to praise you too much, I hardly know you, a relatively constructive, healthy person with a reasonable social network and purpose in life. So we would bet on you, Eric. We had an outgrowing addiction is about, you're going to zero in on where you went to visit your parents. They're meaningful to you. You're not going to sneak around and use meth or amphetamines, Adderall while you're at home. You have values and a social structure, and you're embedded in the culture in a positive way. And when Zach and I work, Zach's a coach, I'm not, with LPP, he helps people refocus on their values, which you did. You know what I mean? You said, well, I'm going home. And you focused, on the message that's that. If there's one thing that we can give you, it's to say you can do that. You can leave the Adderall behind. We're not blaming you for, misusing it. We're saying if you're not liking the way that you use it, that's something you can bring into advisement and bring under control. Zach and I, our current podcast, which is coming out, I think, tomorrow, help me. Are you pretty aware of current culture? There's a movie out called Zola now. It stars a woman named Lee Keough. Is that her name? Do you know who I'm speaking of? Elvis Presley's granddaughter?
No, I don't.
Her last name is Keough.
Okay.
And she's the granddaughter of Elvis Presley. And her father was kind of a musician who was married to Elvis Presley's daughter, who was married subsequently to Michael Jackson. Do you know her name? Can you help me with that? Somebody Presley.
It's on the tip of my tongue. I don't know if I'm going to get it in time.
I'm really bad with this. So she's a successful actress. She's in a current movie called Zola. She split her time between her mother, who was married to Michael Jackson, her father, then to Michael Jackson for 2 years, then to Nicolas Cage, and that lasted 2 years. So she's not a steady presence, her mother. And she spent a lot of her time with her father, who was poor. And she says, that kind of worked for me, getting to see being rich and being poor. And, she's a relatively well-adjusted human being. Then her younger brother committed suicide. And it's really quite brilliant the way she describes it. She says, I've had traumatic events. I've broken up with lovers. I sort of have a file for dealing with that. I didn't have a file for dealing with my brother committing suicide. And she didn't speak at all for 2 weeks. And she stayed in bed for 4 months. So that's, we're considering you're moving and, your dog dying. That's really bad. But she didn't become addicted. She doesn't mention even going to therapy. She has a husband. She has friends. She has work. She doesn't mention taking antidepressants or going to therapy or certainly taking opioids. And eventually she got out of bed and she actually studied becoming, I'm going to have another trouble with another word there. Do you know the term doula? I think it's your.
Oh yeah, doula, the natural.
She became a coach to help people get through death experiences. So it's Zach and my talk is called People Who Are Invulnerable to Addiction. And here's a woman, she went through as bad a trauma as you can go through, A, and B, she went off the tracks. She couldn't get out of bed. But she still didn't become addicted. She still didn't turn to a drug or an alcohol or any kind of addictive experience. She still struggled to fight her way back to life and to be a constructive family member, a professional. She's in this new movie. and helper. So in the larger scale of things, people can go through some really bad periods. They can be somewhat addicted and maybe possibly severely addicted. But if you look at the larger frame of people's lives, if they're tied to life or able to be tied to life, if they're able to form intimate relationships, if they're able to have purpose, if they have underlying values, if they have children, if they want to make a contribution to society, odds are they're going to be okay. You could have gone farther off track, and I still probably would have bet on you, Eric, although I'm glad that you're a good one. And that's a whole different way of thinking about addiction and becoming involved in addictive ways. The benefit you give yourself the benefit of the doubt. You're basically going to come out of it, A, and B, what's going to make you come out of it is emphasizing your positive involvements in life, reconnecting to them or emphasizing them. And I mean, your example is you went home to your parents. I mean, I know tons of people who would say something like, well, I was basically an alcoholic, but whenever I went home to visit my parents, I drank normally. And so then as a coach, you would say, what is it that makes you drink normally when you're at home with your parents? Can we widen that circle to the part of your life where you're not drinking normally? Can we expand the healthy portion? Because why do you not? Because, well, I want to have a good relationship with them. I don't want to embarrass myself in front of people I love and who I value. And so that's the opposite of the disease model or the trauma model. Just think about the worst thing about your life. Think about all your limitations. Go back to where you were powerless and generalize from there to who you are. We generalize in the opposite direction from the positives to who you are and who you can be. Right. So if I were your coach, I would have started out by saying, Eric, how did you get such damn good teeth? You know, you try and brush daily, you try not to eat sweets, you try and stay in control of your life a little bit. And you've had some success. Look at you, you're in reasonably good shape. That's who you are. You're not somebody who wakes up in the morning thinking about when you're going to take, Adderall again. That's the real you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that, as you mentioned before, Nora Volkow claims that addiction is a disease of free will. And so her response to that is to completely give up free will, right? Is to say that I am an addict. I am this way forever. Whereas your approach to it is really free will based. It's really all about the individual personal responsibility and not just giving up, right? I mean, how does that model of free will being a disease, or the disease of free will, still maintain its grip over us? And how does that, because it seems like everything that you present in your work seems so obvious, where you give examples of talking to audiences who have kicked cigarette addictions or whatever, where the numbers clearly seem to state that addiction is a thing that people grow out of naturally. How does the disease model still have such a death grip on our culture?
It's almost as though you and I are switching roles here, Eric. I was going to jump in and say, how is it helpful? If you're a helping person, how is it helpful to tell somebody, oh, you have a disease of the free will you can't change? How is that helpful? And one way Zach, of course, works with children and teens. Who thinks that that's a good approach with the young person, who has one or another problem? Biting their nails or, not doing their homework or getting in fights. Who thinks it's a good idea to say to them, oh, that's who you are. That's a brain disease. You can't get out of that. You have no choice. And in fact, the answer to that question is we actually go quite a bit in that direction now in diagnosing those problems as being something inherent or a brain disease. And I likewise stress the whole trauma model is based on that. Zach actually attended a workshop with somebody, well, maybe I'll mention his name, Gabor Mate. And Gabor does a riff. And his riff is there anybody here who's had an addiction or serious problem who doesn't think that they had trauma in their life? And, excuse my terminology, some poor slob, some poor schmuck raises his hand. And this isn't going to go well. So, Gabor interviews him, and the guy says, well, did you ever get picked on in school? And the kid says, well, sometimes I didn't. And he says, did you ever tell your parents about it? And he says, no. And then Gabor has now imputed a trauma on this person who's had probably more or less average experiences. Everybody's had some bad run-ins in school. And everybody in the audience cheers and hollers and hoots. And when Zach participated in that and observed it, and when I think about it, I think, who feels that's helpful? Who feels that's a good way to encourage a person? And, I look on, I think it's Lee Keough. I wish we had some contemporary culture expert. I just saw the movie Zola. Somebody could say your brother committed suicide. No wonder you went crazy, quit your job, got divorced, started taking drugs. But instead, you could get her in front of an audience and say, gosh, it wasn't a childhood trauma. She's a young woman, she's in her 20s. Nobody could have, that was as bad a trauma as a human being could experience. And yet you overcame it. Can we talk about that? About how you were able to do that, what you relied on, and what you relied on was her family, her husband, her friends, her goals in life, her desire to be a positive person in the world and to help other human beings. She transformed that. Isn't that the kind of therapy and helpfulness that we want to explore? And instead, almost intentionally, we seem to go in the opposite direction. And so it's just spiritually, it's mystifying and mind-boggling to me. At a practical level, just get down to that. I did work with a group. I was on the board of a group called Above and Beyond, which works in one of the worst neighborhoods in Chicago. It's a group of people. There's a lot of homelessness, a lot of drug addiction and alcoholism, a lot of fractured families, a lot of people who've never grasped any kind of work or education. And Above and Beyond, they didn't follow my philosophy. Maybe to some extent they knew about me. They work with those people who are, they're the worst victims. As you're aware, last year, was that 2020?
2020.
93,000 people died due to drugs. It's a constantly increasing level. And people say, well, the pandemic, but that's not the explanation, because 2019 was a record, and the beginning of 2020, it was going up more. And it's most experienced, as you were saying, by the group of people. There's a large segment of American society, think about Appalachia, think about inner city Baltimore, and around the country, they take the greatest brunt of this experience. And what's the disease model tell us? Well, we should give them medications or we should put them in hospitals. It's the exact opposite answer is appropriate. We need to be able to help them construct a reasonable life, to have a positive. There's 4 pillars that we usually speak of: home, purpose, like education, community, and health. They have to be generally healthy. And underlying all of those things is the opposite of Dora Volko's disease of the free will. It's the belief in your own agency that you can have a positive impact. That's the most essential ingredient that you want to give to a child, or that you want to give to a client, or that you want to encourage in American society, is that you have the capacity to turn your life in a positive direction. And if you, Eric, if you said, well, you read Outgrowing Addiction and that encouraged you to believe, well, I've got some choice here, I can move in a little positive direction. If we made some small contribution to that, and I believe your underlying optimism and agency goes well beyond anything Zach or I have ever said, well, then we made a therapeutic contribution, and it's the essential contribution that we need to reverse our addiction maelstrom and our death due to drugs maelstrom.
Yeah. There's something that comes to mind as you're talking about Gabor Mate, who is extremely popular. He's one of the hottest, therapists, psychologists. Is he a psychologist or is he?
Gabor Mate is a physician.
Physician, okay.
And he's very proud of the fact that he's an internist, that he's not a psychiatrist.
Okay. Yeah. So there seems to be, with his trauma model that everyone has a trauma that they're dealing with, there seems to be this recurring theme between the trauma model and the disease model of it's not your fault, right? That you have this thing that you couldn't help. And it doesn't, like you said before, it requires you to live in that, to make that your identity. And I see the same thing in other areas of American culture. I mean, when you think about the calls of systemic racism and how everything needs to be viewed through the lens of race, it's kind of this thing of, and this isn't to say that systemic racism does exist. There is serious traumas, there is systemic racism, there is addictions. But whenever you view everything that happens to you as being caused by something that isn't in your control, it's like just making a big excuse for yourself. And I wonder what these things, like, do you see that connection?
I don't want you to get us in any trouble, Eric, here. I mean, now we're into a political hotspot. Maybe I hope I can reframe it in a positive way. What makes Zach and I have a bunch of good coaches in the Life Process program. What makes them good coaches is conveying to somebody that you have control over your life without putting them down. I mean, you could say, well, if I have control over my life, if everything's screwed up, then that's my fault. You have to avoid that dichotomy. It's like you said, well, some things have happened to me. I was in a bad place. I wasn't my best self. You have to have the humanity and the compassion to understand that about a human being, that they're laboring under negative influences. You have to respect that without making that the foundation of who you are. This is so short-circuited that it doesn't do justice. So if you ask the person about what traumas they've had, that respects their life. Well, my parents were divorced. I was in foster care. By the way, there's 10 million examples of this. Who's the woman who's the greatest gymnast of all time? You know her name?
The current one, Simone Biles.
Yes.
Yeah.
She and her sister were raised in foster care. Their mother wasn't capable. Their mother was, I think it was heroin. She couldn't take care of them. She put them in foster care. And eventually they were adopted, I think, by an uncle and an aunt. So, and they were adopted finally back into their own family when I think her sister was 2 and she was 5. She's had as much trauma as anybody's going to have or want to have. And you have to respect that. And if you were dealing with her as a counselor, you would say, well, I realize you felt pushed around and possibly not loved. But the question then becomes, where are we going to go from here? And Simone Biles, is that her name? She's not somebody you need to help. somehow, incredibly enough, she just put this all together on her own, and she's like a, a creator of strength. But I would use her as a model rather than somebody who's experienced trauma and then their life is going completely off the cliff. And that's the goal, is to respect people from where they come, respect the difficulties they've experienced, empathize with, the bad moments they've had. I mean, I'm not going to put you down because, you had some family problems. I'm not going to make fun of you. I'm not going to call you a weakling, but I am going to try and turn you in a direction that you already were inclined to go on your own, which is, let's make a positive life forward. Because what else is there in life? It is existentialism. Whatever age you are, we're only going to go forward from here. If you're a kid, if you're an adult, even if you're a senior citizen, our only options are going forward. And that's what our coaching's about. And our model of addiction is built. I'll give you one strange statistic, one more study. I tap both into personal experience in my memoir and into the research. After I announced that smoking was addictive in 1975, believe it or not, the Department of Health and Human Services didn't announce that smoking was addictive until the early 80s. And then a large number of people quit smoking. So then in 1989, they released the volume, People Who Don't Quit. And they studied all the people who were slower to quit smoking. They didn't, once the Surgeon General's report came out in 1964, who didn't quit. And they were hypothesizing, well, they were more dependent, they had less psychological efficacy. And what they found out is there was no difference between the people who quit and the people who didn't quit. And in fact, although half the people quit within the first 10 years of the Surgeon General's report, a cancer report, half of the remainder kept quitting every couple of years. For some reason, some people, whatever, it takes longer for the message to seep in. It's like it takes longer for some people to get inoculated against COVID. But eventually, even a majority of the resistant get not roped in and become engaged. So there's no reason to ever quit on any human being. There's no reason to say, well, okay, that's a real addict. That guy will never quit smoking. I mean, some people can quit, being alcoholics or heroin addicts, but not that guy. There's no grounds for saying that about any human being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think maybe you can let me know if you see this the same way, but it seems as though perhaps one of the things that keeps us stuck on the, Alcoholics Anonymous or the medication or brain chemistry type of outlook on this is, people want immediate results. And the process that you're describing takes time. It's a very, you have to kind of be patient and hardworking to get the results that you're talking about. With telling people that they're diseased and that they have a disease and all they need to do is abstain, or giving them some medication to help them abstain is a quick fix. I can tell myself I'm going to stop drinking today and commit to that and go to my meetings, and I'll, that thing will be changed right away. And then there's also the problem of scale, I think, where it's a lot easier to just take a cohort of people who are alcoholics and say, you're diseased, you all need to stop drinking, versus working individually with them like your program does and figuring out the life situational, the aspects of their life that are perhaps contributing to their addiction. Do you see those two things as being problems as well?
One of the things that we're getting back to something, a good coach doesn't reflect back on a person's, is completely empathic and non-accusatory and not guilt inspiring. You're saying to the person, all right, obviously you're here with a problem. I'm not going to add to your problem. You realize that you've had a problem. Let's be realistic about what that problem was. And then, it's not my job to guilt trip you. I'm not going to tell you to acknowledge all the bad things you've done. You've come here probably weighed down by those things. We're going to turn in a positive direction. But yes, our society believes in magical solutions. The whole disease model, the whole idea that medication can cure addiction or mental illness, it's not enough to say it's wrong. It's important to say it's a fantasy, but it's a self-destructive fantasy. There's a group called the Global Tobacco Initiative at Harvard, and they very much push nicotine replacement therapy. That's where you take a patch or you take cigarettes. And they spent millions on it worldwide. And then they did a study of people who quit smoking with or without NRT, nicotine replacement therapy. And lo and behold, the most dependent smokers who quit with Nicorettes were 3 times as likely to relapse as those who quit on their own. And why would you, I know you know why would that be, why is that commonsensical?
Well, because they still have that as part of their life, right? They've not committed or gone. I'm not really articulating this well, but I guess the general idea would be that it's still a part of their life. They're still relying on it.
Think about the word agency. Just throw the word agency in your reaction to that story. One group Nicorettes and one group quit on their own.
Yeah, the group that quit on their own exhibited and proved to themselves that they have agency over their decisions.
And you said it. Well, maybe it was somewhat painful for them. I mean, it wasn't quitting. An addiction generally isn't fun. I mean, it's hard. It creates effort. It produces something called withdrawal, an emotional reaction. But when you know that you've done it on your own, later in life, you're not going to say, I need to start smoking again. If you say, I quit because of the Nicorettes, at some point you're going to stop taking the Nicorettes. You're unlikely to do that for the rest of your life. And then it's almost as though that was the crutch. It's sort of like Dumbo the elephant flying with that feather. The feather was the reason I quit. And really, the most important thing that the Life Process Program emphasizes for people is that you're your own agency of change. That's the most important thing in the 4 pillars approach of recovery. It's good to have a home. It's good to have a community. It's good to have a purpose. It's good to have your health. But you have to feel that you're in charge. And that's motivational interviewing is the most important therapy. The bottom line of motivational interviewing is that the therapist isn't telling you how to get better. The therapist, he or she, is encouraging you to tap into your own personal resources, to connect the dots, to see why it is that you want and can change your own life.
And that's the method that Life Process Program uses, right? Coaches are using motivational.
No, I don't have to promote motivational interviewing. They do it, everybody knows. Even Nora Volkow knows that's the best approach. They have a whole booklet for it at the NIDA. And our approach and motivational interviewing is about casting back the issues to the individual. Why is it you're using in a negative way? Why do you feel it's harmful to you? What is important in your life that it's violating? How do you feel about that? What other options do you have? The whole game is played on their part of the net. Realize, it's not the group or the therapy that's creating the change. It's the individual. You're a coach. In a way, the Life Process Program is online, and we communicate that way. I really believe that online coaching is actually a better way of getting people to change and to respect themselves and to make the changes they need. than, residential therapy or ongoing intensive therapy, because it's obvious that that's where the change has to take place, is in the individual, the client, him or herself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe we can switch gears a little bit here now and talk more specifically about your memoir. Everything, all these ideas, learning about them in Outgrowing Addiction for the first time, it just seemed like something I knew, but I didn't know how to articulate or know the foundation of. And so everything that we've already talked about just seems to make so much sense to me. And I already tried to play.
The title of the Outgrowing Addiction, Using Common Sense Instead of Disease Therapy.
Exactly.
It's nothing we've said today is like, brain chemistry.
Yeah.
I got off the amphetamines because, I believed I could. I went home. My situation calmed down. I didn't like myself for doing them, and I like myself more not doing them.
Yeah.
It ain't brain science.
Yeah. And if anyone listening or watching wants to hear pushback on these ideas, I would just ask you to go watch the interview I did with Zach Rhodes last year, I think, where we spent the first half. I was a skeptic and trying to poke holes in the theories, and he parried me at every turn. So let's switch to the memoir now, Dr. Peele. And this is kind of where my questions, I hope, don't come across as rude or...
do you have a copy of the book you can hold up?
I don't. I read it online. I'll make sure to... Do you have a copy handy you can hold up?
Let me see if I have one right here. That's
it is.
On the edge of the earth there, Hudson River. I'll just read the caption. Stanton Peele is a true pioneer of addiction research and theory. His ideas must be reckoned with by anybody who is serious about understanding addiction. Maya Salovitz, author of Unbroken Brain.
Yeah, and there's
all right. Back again.
Well, thank you for grabbing that.
You're going to attack me now. Go ahead.
Yep, I'm gonna attack you now. So one of the, you're very open in the book about how your personality and your approach have maybe gotten in the way or limited the amount of success that you've personally experienced, personally and professionally. Does it concern you at all that sort of reputation in the industry might actually be slowing down your ideas from spreading? Do you worry about that?
Well, let me try and just lay it out there without giving an answer. My being in opposition to the key ideas in the field means that I'm going to have a lot of conflict with people. That's just the way it's going to be. And it's possible to make nice to people and not be clear on how much you're disagreeing with them and how important that is to you. So I'm not going to claim that I thought this out. I mean, it's my natural style to be combative and possibly sometimes even insulting. On the other hand, I cite examples of people, famous, there are people, well, who believe a lot of the things that I believe. I'll name them. Bruce Alexander, the developer of Rat Park, Mark Lewis, Sally Sattel, brilliant people. It's not a comfortable thing to go to a group of people and to kind of set yourself up in opposition to them. I have online a time when I was on the Oprah Winfrey Show and the entire audience and I were going and combating about it. On the other hand, it's remarkable to me that sometimes people who pretty much agree with me, after they get done being with an audience, the audience sort of doesn't know that they actually disagree with them. And I give one amazing example. George Soros funded the Drug Policy Alliance initially. He also funds the Open Society Foundation. And Carl Hart gave a speech about meth, and he likened it to the crack epidemic. And I mean, Carl's basic line is everything you believe about drugs is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And Carl gave his talk, and he introduced me from the audience. There's Stanton Peele. Many or most of the ideas I'm going to express, he came up with first. So I got up. God, I have a lot of gall in front of the audience, and I said, "Here's 5 things I want to ask you. Do you believe about addiction?" And then I listed 5 key myths. Do you believe if you take opiates for long enough, you have to get addicted? Do you believe that nobody can recover from addiction without undergoing treatment? And I went through a list of these things. I kind of pissed everybody off, probably. And then during the course of the presentation, one of the presenters presented pictures of before and after meth addicts. And her point, she was making her name, she's a big public health official in New York City, is Holly Catania. Her point was it violated their human rights to show a picture of them being so destroyed by the drug. Carl's whole model is that people aren't destroyed by taking a drug, that a lot else was going on in their lives before that. That before and after picture is like a joke. It's like a myth. It's one of the myths that he's attacking. And yet one of the presenters at that meeting presented one of the myths that Carl Hart was running this whole thing, and it was a packed audience disputing. And Carl didn't say anything about it. Nobody said it. Nobody on the panel said anything about it. A person who I speak quite a bit about, Kasia Malinowska, who's the head of the drug policy group for the Open Society. So the whole group attended a seminar about dispelling drug myths, and they listened and sat to somebody presenting a drug myth. So, and Carl's point and my point, these myths kill people. So somebody might say, can you believe Stanton Peele got up and pissed off a whole group of people? Well, damn my hide. On the other hand, 93,000 people died of drugs last year, and Open Society Foundation is supposedly presenting ideas that allow people to get beyond that, to see their agency, to see how if you can affect their lives in a positive way, they're going to overcome addiction. And they're actually presenting myths that prevent that from occurring. So I'm an iconoclast. I get pissed off. I piss other people off. But Carl Hart, God bless his soul, he's a brilliant man. He's a nice man. He didn't have any positive effect in that presentation. Did I have a positive effect pissing off a bunch of people? I talk about how Kasia Malinowska would never have me speak in front of the Open Society Foundation. If you talk to her, she's like, Stanton Peele, what a a-hole, she would say. I would never have him. He pisses people off. But the point is that neither Carl or I were particularly successful in that environment. Carl's a successful human being, God bless him. He's a professor of psychology. He's done a lot of other work to get that position. And my book is about how a scientific life on the edge, how have I actually managed to get through life, presenting unpopular ideas, often doing it in a way that pisses people off on the Oprah show or in front of this group. And how have I persisted? A, how have I made a living? And B, how have I sustained myself? I'm 75. And I devoted the book to Semmelweis, the guy who discovered the germ theory of infection. Semmelweis didn't make it to 50. He died in an insane asylum. He showed that by using antiseptic procedures, you could prevent child death and infection of mothers. And people didn't know about the germ theory. They didn't believe him. And he went crazy. So for better or worse, I'm a human being who's presented a lot of ideas which have become more and more adopted. I mean, when I said addiction is not limited to drugs, that's now called process addiction. When I say self-cure takes place regularly, people acknowledge that. When I say you have to deal with the fundamentals in people's lives, even Nora Volkow is beginning to say that. I've even had a recent impact on harm reduction where I say harm reduction conceived of as just giving people medications is inadequate, it's harmful. You have to look at the whole human being and say harm reduction means improving a person's life, whether or not they continue to take their addictive drug. All of my ideas are out there and they've had a positive impact. And the only question is, how am I, and the question I address in the book is, how am I going to, how was I able to sustain myself, put 3 kids through college, make a living, have a reasonable lifestyle, and not go crazy. And so I have my own way of dealing with that. And, I more or less made it into adulthood with that approach.
Yeah, fair. But I definitely hear you in that, you believe in what you believe it to be true. You have evidence, there's facts backing up your stance, and it angers you to see people who claim to want to change our perspective on drugs not take moments like that to change perspectives. But I guess you didn't really answer my question of, do you think that specifically has held these ideas from becoming more popular? Because you are, as they mentioned in the book, a lot of this starts with you and Love and Addiction, where you start to open up the conversation to there's the processes type of thing. So do you see your current, let me maybe ask this a different way. There's at least 1.5, maybe 2 full chapters of, 2 chapters where you are taking contemporaries or people who, were in the field recently who either agree with you or disagree with you. They either agree with you up to a point or they completely disagree with you. And you kind of go through each one and you point out where they're wrong. You give praise where it's due, but you don't withhold criticism, I would say.
That makes me sound slightly reasonable, but I do give them some praise. And, Zach said, Stanton, when you write about everybody, and Zach has good relations with every one of those people.
Yeah.
He said, start out by, talking about their positives. So Zach, gave me some advice along those lines.
That's good. Yeah.
And then I go and I say, I'm an idealist. I believe there's a theory of addiction that makes sense that we have to get to. I think they fall short. And so, I even slightly sometimes, I don't know, Zach and I get along. Well, Zach gets along with people.
Yeah.
To say that I get along with Zach is sort of like saying, well, Zach can get along with people. And we almost have some differences sometimes. Talking about Carl Hart. Carl Hart's been a great friend to Zach. And Carl Hart's always been nice to me. But I say, well, Carl falls short. He doesn't have a model of addiction. He sort of says, well, a lot of people take drugs and they don't have problems. Some do. Okay. And we have to recognize that most drug use is constructive and even positive. But then we have to have a model for what is it about people in their lives that allows them, and we've gone over that a little bit, to took that thing into their lives in a way that they become dependent on in a negative way. And my model of addiction is that that's not limited to drugs. Carl doesn't go there. And I feel that's a limitation of his approach. And Zach will sort of say, well, he implies that. So I'll try and give Carl the benefit of the doubt. And Carl, I'm sure, likes Zach better than he likes me. And, I'm trying to be completely intellectually honest. So Zach and I have different approaches. We have different strengths. He has better relationships with all of those people. But I have created a theory of addiction that stands by itself, which is present. They now have added the life process model of addiction to Wikipedia. Up until while I was writing the book, up until like last fall, uh, the addiction section of Wikipedia had a straight brain disease model. That's what it said addiction was. It's now added. A group of social scientists and psychologists opposes this view of addiction. It says it's not accurate either in terms of the evidence, and it also is detrimental for dealing with addiction. And it has a string of references. Sally Satel is one of them, and I'm one of the references. So I've invade my way into mainstream thinking. Could I have done it better by being more gradualistic and less oppositional? You can be the judge. What do you think?
I don't know. I found myself going back and forth on this while thinking about it, because on one hand, I kind of get the sense from at least Dr. Carl Hart that he is taking on one fight at a time, where he's trying to be more, diplomatic and, like you said, gradualistic, and not try to revolutionize the entire field at once, but start getting, people thinking differently about it in parts. But at the same time, I mean, in a way, I feel it's good for the future of the field in the way that you did it. But I think that it was probably a really bad thing for you going through life, and definitely held you back. But it seems to me as though you need a wrecking ball to come in so that you can start rebuilding. But yeah, I don't know. I'm up in the air on that one.
No, Eric, I'm going to go on your summary. I don't know if I'm going to do any better than what you just said, in terms of people evaluating the good and the bad of Stanton Peele. I'm just going to rest my case on what you said. It's if I'm brought up for ultimate judgment, if you're the judge and you come down with what you said, I'll take it.
All right. So how much, you also had a very unique path to get where you were. I mean, you started off as a sociologist?
I'm a psychologist.
Social psychologist. Okay.
I talk about how I discovered addiction. And
right.
From the start, I wasn't in recovery. I have used drugs. I mentioned that I shot up heroin, which, that's nothing. Carl talks about shooting up heroin regularly, but I did. I didn't expect to become addicted. I didn't. And then I noticed people becoming involved in negative experiences, like love experiences, that had extremely destructive effects. And of course, I keep referring to Anthony Bourdain. Nobody commits suicide when they quit smoking. Really, people don't commit suicide when they quit heroin. When you lose a love attachment, which is your whole life, it's amazing how people react. It's not infrequent that people kill somebody or kill themselves, because that's your whole essence, your whole gut is taken out of you. That's really withdrawal. So I noticed that about people. I started formulating a model, and I have a PhD in social psychology, which I broadened to clinical psychology. And at the University of Michigan, they had animal laboratories, the most famous one in the country. And when I tell this story, it's sort of unbelievable. I was having an affair with a woman in my apartment complex. By the way, I had a major academic publisher who wanted to publish my memoir. And that was an example of something. They said, well, don't mention you had an affair with her. And I said, well, I don't know. And then I have an older friend who said to me, well, that's sort of your life. That's sort of how you work. And her father was a famous anesthesiologist. When I tell this story, I sort of can't believe it myself. And I convinced the woman I was interested. They don't let everybody in those animal labs. At the time, there was a lot of, and there still is, a lot of opposition. and animal labs at the University of Chicago had been burned or wrecked. She believed in me. And her father introduced me to the head of the Department of Pharmacology at the University of Michigan. And I went and talked to him. He had a lot on his mind, other than talking to a 24-year-old kid in dungarees. And I said, well, I'm interested in addiction. I'd like to see the animal labs. And he let me go, and I went with my colleague, Archie Brodsky. This is before we written Love and Addiction. And when I went there, the guy who was in charge of the labs, a man named James Woods, I think he's still an active professor of pharmacology. He went over that normal bullshit. Well, addiction is defined by tolerance and withdrawal. And then I said, well, and certain drugs produce that and certain drugs don't. And I say, well, when people smoke marijuana, don't they become more adept at driving and carrying out daily activities as they use the drug? Isn't that tolerance? And he said, well, you could call that tolerance. And then I said, well, this is before smoking was thought of as addictive. I said, when people quit smoking, don't they, climb the walls and they don't know what to do with themselves in the wall? Isn't that withdrawal? He said, you could call that withdrawal. And so, then we walked around the lab and people would argue with me when I talked about my theories of addiction. They said, well, animals become addicted. How can it be involved with who you are in life and what kind of a person you are? And when I went to the animal labs, their monkeys were kept in a small cage, maybe 4 feet high, 18 inches wide. And the way they measure drugs is they have a catheter implanted in their spine. And the monkey can press a lever to get narcotics or whatever drug. And as soon as I saw it, I said, that's a model of addiction. That proves that an organism will take a drug and become addicted to it and rely on it. What if the monkey was around in a forest and swinging from trees and having dates with other monkeys? Would they be interested in getting narcotics the way they are in the cage? And Bruce Alexander and we wrote that in Love and Addiction, and Bruce Alexander read that, and he designed Rat Park based on that, where you gave morphine solution to rats alone in a cage, and they took a choice between the morphine solution and water. They would drink all the morphine solution. Then you put them in Rat Park, where there were 8 rats. There was a Ferris wheel, a lot of room to go around in, and sexual interaction between the rats. And they stopped taking the morphine. Mm-hmm. He did an experimental version of that. And so, it's a funny way that I thought about addiction. I broadened it to other things. I realized how it was implicated completely in the entire life cycle of the organism. And that had that immediate impact of impacting Bruce Alexander. And that's my style. And at the same time that I did write about academics, I did review the research. I did review the research about people quitting addictions on their own and natural recovery. And I integrated those two things. So that's my story of how I made my discovery. And I wanted to describe it to people to show the rich context of coming up with a theory of addiction.
Yeah, I think it's a good story. And I love stories like that you also have Harvard Business School and political research in your background as well. So in a sense, you were this outsider kind of coming in and making the outsider argument. So you were like a double outsider, which I think is a cool story. That's like, I forget what Charles Darwin actually was, but he wasn't taught to see evolution, but he ended up getting there as, what was he on he was a sailor or something?
I was answering the question. I had to survive. I've never had a job in the addiction field. And the only strange job I've had in academia was I was a professor, an assistant professor of organizational behavior at Harvard Business School. So I've operated in a kind of upper echelon, but not the addiction echelon. Yeah. And I wrote Love and Addiction while I was at the Harvard Business School. And so how did I survive? How did I get a certain amount of recognition? At the same time that I was never fully accepted or part of the mainstream. How did that allow me to have the views that I did? But then how did I survive? And, at times I barely survived. But, as I said, I'm 75. And then, I talked about, I think it's Lee Keough. She had one sibling who committed suicide. I had one sibling, a brother, who committed suicide. So, my mental health origins are, if you trace it back, you'd have to say, not the most completely stable foundation. And so, I don't present myself as a trauma victim. I say, well, you judge that for yourself. I mean, Gabor Mate will say I'm a trauma victim. I'm an example of somebody who's made a reasonable progress in life and created some kind of life for himself. And this is something, you're aware Zach had a more troubled relationship with drugs in his past, perhaps, than I did. We both taken heroin, but he had a bad patch there. And yet he's a positively involved, constructive human being. And when I say this, I'm not being glib. I deal better, the key people I deal with in my life are people who have reason to say they've had some trauma in their background. I prefer human beings who understand that life doesn't always go along in the fast lane or smoothly. I appreciate people who understand that there are negatives to life. One reason is then they can realize that now they have things pretty good. Maybe things were bad then. But Zach appreciates where he's at in life now. And then, secondly, they have a keener understanding and a keener questioning of life. They're more likely to say, well, I know that, everything's not positive. I can empathize with that. I can appreciate and accept that. So, I haven't had an ideal life. I'm far from an ideal person. But I've had a positive life in terms of the impact I've had on society and on thinking and on certain key relationships. And that's just going to have to be, my epitaph.
Yeah. You actually brought up your brother who committed suicide. And one of the things I did want to ask you, I was going back and forth on whether this would be worth asking, but I was surprised at how absent any information about him was from the book. It doesn't seem as though that is something you wanted to talk too much about. Is that because it's your story? It's your story?
Like this, I don't know if you're ever going to write your memoir. You're in a constant dilemma. My brother's dead, so he's not going to sue me. Although his widow's still alive and I'm friendly with her. You're always in the balancing act about how much you want to say about them or reveal about them. I've thought about my brother and why he committed suicide. My brother's dead. He's not going to sue me. Obviously, he had a bad life outcome. Nothing I'm going to say is going to make it better or worse. On the other hand, I didn't want to totally dissect the experience he had at the time of his death. But I did contrast my and his outlook on life. I did tell stories about that when we were children. My brother committed suicide as an adult. He was 59. So he didn't commit suicide in childhood. But we had, given our somewhat troubled family, by the way, Simone Biles' brother was charged with murder. So she went with one family with her sister. She had another sister and a brother. You can never tell how it's all going to work out. Everybody has a different experience. And I wanted to contrast how I and my brother came out differently given the same background. At my brother's memorial service, which was well attended, he was well liked. My former wife, I have a lot of respect for her. She got up and said, I'll never understand the exploding storm, uh, the maelstrom that was the household that Stanton and Jeffrey came out of. I just can't fathom it. And it's sort of like, a Big Bang Theory. They just blew out of there. But, obviously it was some kind of a powerful experience.
Yeah, fair. That makes sense. I mean, I totally understand why you wouldn't want to, use your speculation of his life to make the points that you're making in the book. That's not fair to him. That's not your responsibility, or should it be? So that's fair, but I had to ask.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah.
Eric, I have a confession to make. You're not the first interview I've done. And sometimes I've been a little disappointed in the interviews. They didn't refer to my memoir at all. They just asked the same old questions about addiction. Well, doesn't it affect your brain in a way that can't change? A guy interviewed me and he said that, and his father had quit drinking. And I said, well, didn't you tell me your father quit drinking? Did his brain change? I mean, what happened? And he said, well, that's a good point. So, I don't come into all of these interviews totally optimistic. I think, oh man, maybe they're going to just ask me these same old silly questions. And Eric, you've exceeded my expectations. You understood the basics. You touched on some key elements of my actual memoir. You not only challenged me, but you did your own interpretation of the material to assimilate it into your own life. I couldn't have asked for more from an interview. And, I thank you. And I thank Zach for having a good, I don't know what his relationship is with you, for knowing you and for having a positive interaction with you.
That really means a lot, Dr. Peele. I'm definitely have been influenced in a positive way by your work. And, I've already put Love and Addiction in my Amazon cart, which I will be diving into soon to absorb the origin of everything. So it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I couldn't have asked for a better way to start my Saturday.
And, I'm glad you got over a little bit of a negative hump in your life, but you'll, you might have some others. Let's go out with a picture of my book here. Scientific Life on the Edge.
There it
I
is.
love the quest to change how we see addiction. You can see I really used a picture of me there, didn't you?
Yeah. And we'll make sure to have a link to that in the notes for this episode, and other works that Dr. Peele has written. So thank you again, Dr. Peele, and I hope you have a good rest of your weekend.
Same to you, Eric. Pleasure seeing you. Bye now.
Bye.